If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, let me know which country you're tuning in from, because this one is wild. And before we get into it, hit like and subscribe so you never miss these unbelievable HOA and Karen stories. The mess began on a warm Friday morning, the kind of morning where the sun felt soft instead of harsh. The neighborhood was quiet except for the usual sounds of sprinklers and early joggers breezing past. My lawn, trimmed 3 days earlier, looked clean and even. I had confirmation because I walked across it that morning while checking the mailbox. Everything felt normal. Around noon, a patrol car rolled up in front of my house. At first, I thought the officer was lost or running plates for something unrelated. It wasn't the first time cops passed through our HOA. The board had a habit of calling them for tiny things, anything to feel important. The officer stepped out, adjusted his belt, and looked around like he was searching for trouble that didn't exist. It wasn't until he walked up my driveway that I realized he was here for me. There was no urgency in his walk. He moved more like a man handling something he'd rather ignore. He stopped a few feet from me and took off his sunglasses. He seemed almost embarrassed. Before he even spoke, his posture told me something was off. His eyes flicked toward the lawn, then back at his notepad, then back at the lawn again. He did this 2 or 3 times as if trying to make sense of something that made no sense. He explained that someone had called 911 5 minutes earlier, reporting that a homeowner's grass had grown to a dangerous and unsightly height. The caller sounded distressed, he said. She insisted the grass was a safety hazard and demanded immediate action. The officer had been dispatched because the wording of the call made it sound like an emergency. He told me he knew it sounded ridiculous, but dispatch had to follow the protocol. When I asked him who called, he didn't even try to hide his sigh. He glanced down at the note again and said the caller was listed as Karen from 3 houses over. Her full name wasn't written, just a partial note and the street number. The officer didn't need more than that. Everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who she was. Karen lived for drama. She walked the neighborhood like she was inspecting troops. Her eyes scanned lawns, porch lights, fences, and garbage bins. She treated HOA rules like sacred scripture. And for reasons known only to her, my house was her favorite target. She called the HOA on me 6 times that year alone. But calling 911 because my grass was growing too fast? That was a new level of obsessive. The officer crouched, running a hand across the lawn blades. He looked confused, then amused, then frustrated. The grass was barely 2 inches tall. He said it was obvious nothing was wrong. There was nothing for him to enforce. He apologized for showing up, but explained he had no choice. Dispatch recorded every complaint, and he had to check it out like any other call. He asked if I had any issues with my neighbors. I told him the truth. I didn't have issues with neighbors, only with Karen. He nodded slowly like that made perfect sense. He said she had made several unnecessary calls in the past, including one where she claimed a moving truck on our street was blocking sunlight from her front window. Another time she called because a kid's soccer ball sat on a lawn for 3 minutes. These calls always forced the department to respond, even if they were ridiculous. The officer stood up and brushed off his hands. He said he'd put a note into record that this was a false complaint, but even he knew it wouldn't stop her. People like Karen treated 911 like a customer service line. That kind of behavior had consequences, and one day it would catch up to her. At that moment, though, he couldn't do anything but file the response and leave. After he walked back to his car, he sat there for a moment. He stared at his computer, shook his head, and laughed to himself like he could barely believe this had happened. Then he pulled away. What he didn't know, and what I discovered minutes later, made everything much worse. As soon as the patrol car turned the corner, Karen marched out of her house like someone who just scored a victory. Her posture was stiff and proud. She walked to my property line, not crossing it, but standing close enough to feel like she was pushing it. There was a self-satisfied grin on her face. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her entire expression told me she wanted a reaction. I ignored her and went back inside, refusing to give her the satisfaction she was hunting for. But when I checked my security cam notifications, I saw something that turned irritation into absolute disbelief. The delivery cam footage from earlier that morning showed Karen herself walking onto my lawn before sunrise. She bent down, tugged at the edges of the grass, and took close-up photos. Then she stepped back and took more pictures from different angles. Her face in the footage was tight with determination. She was crafting evidence for her little emergency call. She didn't just call 911, she staged her own false crime scene. The footage made it clear she tampered with my lawn before calling. She didn't actually damage anything, but the intent was obvious. She wanted a violation. She wanted trouble. She wanted control. That footage became the spark that changed everything. Because once I had proof, real proof, the situation shifted from annoying to serious. I realized Karen wasn't just being petty, she had crossed into dangerous territory. Filing false emergency calls was already a big deal. Adding evidence tampering on top of it made everything bigger. But the moment I really understood how far she was willing to go came later that evening, when I heard voices outside, familiar ones, and realized she had done something even worse. The investigation into her behavior was about to escalate fast. The morning after the 911 call hung over the neighborhood like a heavy cloud. Word always traveled fast here, especially when Karen believed she had done something heroic. By sunrise, she was already pacing around her yard, pretending to inspect imaginary violations as if she were some self-appointed inspector for the entire block. I stepped onto my porch with a mug of coffee, trying to shake off the stress of her late-night theatrics. I had barely taken 2 sips when I noticed a police cruiser rolling down the street. It wasn't speeding, it wasn't blaring sirens, it was moving at a calm, steady pace, like the officer had already guessed something about the supposed emergency didn't add up. Karen, of course, burst from her front door and sprinted across her lawn like she'd been waiting on that driveway since dawn. She waved her arms at the officer, pulling him toward my property like she had caught a dangerous criminal. I stood still, letting the entire scene unfold in silence. The officer approached with a professional calm. He surveyed the yard first. It had been freshly cut just the week before. The grass was short, clean, and neatly edged. The sunlight reflected off the blades, making it look even more manicured than usual. If anything, it looked better than half the homes on the street. Karen hovered behind him, pointing and huffing dramatically as she tried to present her case. She gestured toward my lawn as if she expected him to pull out handcuffs and drag me off then and there. The officer finally turned to me. He asked a simple question with a tone that said he expected a simple explanation. I gave it, calmly, quietly, just as the camera I'd installed above the garage recorded everything. He listened, then he crouched down and inspected the grass himself. He even ran his hand along the edge near the sidewalk, checking if anything was overgrown or obstructing passage. When he stood up again, he looked confused, not because the situation was unclear, but because it was so obviously the opposite of what had been reported. Karen tried to argue. She stepped forward, raising her voice like she was trying to force a reaction. But the officer had already formed his own opinion. It was written all over his face. He glanced between us, then at the lawn, and shook his head ever so slightly. The moment stretched out in awkward silence. Karen tapped her foot impatiently, expecting him to reprimand me at any moment. She seemed so sure she would win this battle that she didn't even register how unimpressed the officer had become. He finally asked her why she had reported it as an emergency instead of contacting the HOA directly or speaking to me first. The question hit her harder than she expected. Her face twitched with irritation. She repeated the same excuse she always used, that she was protecting the integrity of the community. But the officer didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't encourage her delusion. He simply looked back at me, then at my unobstructed, freshly cut yard. He didn't say it outright, but it was clear he had already reached a conclusion. She had wasted his time. He took a moment to jot down notes, and Karen leaned in, trying to peek at what he wrote. She was desperate to make sure the officer blamed me, but no amount of stretching or squinting could give her the reassurance she wanted. When he finished, he took one last slow walk around my property. He checked the sidewalk, the driveway edge, the growth around the mailbox, and then circled back to the front door. The entire time, Karen followed him like a shadow, trying to direct him towards something, anything that would justify her call. But there was nothing. When he returned to me, he spoke with a tone that held a mix of clarity and finality. Whatever he said left no question about who was actually in the wrong. Karen heard it too, and for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, she was speechless. Her face fell, not dramatically, not with tears, just a slow, sinking realization that her plan had completely fallen apart. The officer returned to his cruiser and drove off, leaving Karen standing in the middle of my yard with the kind of stunned expression only accountability can create. She tried to recover her confidence, smoothing her hair and pretending she hadn't just embarrassed herself in front of the entire street. But the neighbors had peeked through curtains and blinds. They had seen everything. She crossed her arms and stormed back to her home without another word. But I knew Karen. She never gave up after one defeat. The officer shutting down her accusation was only the beginning. She would find something else to complain about, something else to exaggerate, something else to twist into a so-called emergency. And I could already feel the next confrontation building like distant thunder. The officer might have seen the truth, but Karen wasn't done. Not even close. The following morning arrived with a strange stillness. It wasn't quiet exactly. The birds were loud, the neighborhood sprinklers clicked on one after another, and a delivery truck rumbled down the street. But there was a different kind of stillness in the air, almost like the entire block was holding its breath. I stepped outside to check the condition of my lawn after the previous day's spectacle. The grass looked perfectly normal for early summer. Not overgrown, not wild, not encroaching on the sidewalk like some invading force, just a regular, healthy yard. What made it even more ridiculous was the fact that my neighbors' lawns looked nearly identical. Yet somehow I was the one being treated like my grass was a national security threat. I pulled a rake from the shed and began clearing a few stray leaves, more out of habit than necessity. As I worked, my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood chat group. Normally I kept it muted, but this time the preview caught my attention. Someone had posted a picture of my yard along with a dramatic caption about property values declining. And, of course, the picture was taken at an angle that made the grass look several inches taller than it actually was. The comments flooded in beneath it. A few neighbors defended me, pointing out how tidy the yard usually was. But the louder voices, the ones who thrived on conflict, immediately sided with Karen. They insisted that the HOA needed to take action before our entire street fell apart. It was hard not to roll my eyes at the absurdity. This was the same group that once held a 30-minute debate on whether a bird feeder counted as external decor. But I wasn't surprised. Karen had influence. She had a way of pushing her narrative until people accepted it simply to avoid dealing with her. Still, the fact that the group chat was now dissecting the length of my grass like it was a community emergency was enough to make anyone feel a spark of irritation. While I finished clearing the yard, I noticed movement near the street. A police cruiser was rolling slowly toward my house, the same model that had responded the day before. It came to a stop right in front of the property line, and the familiar officer stepped out. He looked tired. Not physically tired, but mentally drained, like someone who'd had to explain the same thing too many times in too short a period. He approached me with a measured pace, one hand resting on his duty belt, though not in a tense or defensive way. It was more like he was bracing himself for whatever nonsense he'd been dragged into now. Before I could greet him, he took a deep breath, as if preparing to deliver unfortunate news. But there was also something else behind it, something closer to frustration mixed with resignation. He began explaining why he was there, though he didn't seem thrilled to be giving the explanation at all. According to him, another 911 call had been placed early that morning. Same complainant, same exact allegation. She had insisted that the dangerously unmaintained lawn was obstructing visibility for pedestrians and creating a safety hazard. The officer didn't buy a word of it, that was obvious from his tone, but he still had to respond because dispatch had recorded it as a repeated complaint from the same address. When a certain number of calls come from one resident, even if the claims are ridiculous, someone has to check just to ensure nothing has escalated. He looked at my lawn, hands on his hips, and let out a long, weary sigh. He told me it was completely fine. Not borderline, not questionable, completely fine. He didn't need tools. He didn't need to measure anything. He could see it with his own eyes. But he also explained that multiple false 911 calls were a serious issue. They tied up resources, they wasted time, and they put actual emergencies at risk. The moment he said that, a shift happened in his expression. He wasn't simply annoyed, he was done. Done in the way a person becomes when they reach the limit of patience for someone who uses the system for personal drama. He walked toward the sidewalk, took a few wide steps as if studying the grass from every angle, and then scribbled something in his notebook. His entire demeanor suggested he wasn't gathering evidence against me, he was building a case to stop the person causing the chaos. When he finished, he asked if I had any security footage timestamps around the time of the complaint. He didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. Karen was escalating, and he was preparing to push back. I had footage, of course. My doorbell camera covered the street pretty well. But before I could pull up the clips, something caught both our attention. Down the block, a familiar figure stood on her front porch, arms folded, watching every move. When she realized we'd noticed her, she ducked back inside like a kid caught spying. The officer closed his notebook, thanked me for my time in a tone that sounded more like an apology than a goodbye, and then headed back to his car. Before leaving, he mentioned that there would likely be follow-up regarding the calls, meaning the situation was now officially on record. As he drove away, I stayed where I was for a moment, listening to the hum of the cruiser fade into the distance. The neighborhood returned to its usual noises: birds, sprinklers, a delivery truck. But underneath all of it, there was an entirely different tension brewing now. The officer wasn't playing along with her story anymore, and Karen had seen it. Not just seen it, felt it. She was losing the narrative she had worked so hard to build, and people like her rarely handled that gracefully. And I had the strange feeling that she wasn't done. Not even close. The following morning arrived with a strange kind of quiet. The neighborhood usually hummed with early sprinklers, dog walkers, and engines warming up. But today, it felt like everyone was deliberately watching their lawns as if the grass itself had become a threat. The tension from Karen's 9/11 stunt still hung in the air, and people were whispering about the officer who couldn't stop laughing at her complaint. I stepped outside before the sun fully took over the sky, wanting to enjoy a rare, calm moment. The dew still clung to the blades of grass. It looked peaceful, normal, exactly as a yard should look. But I could already tell the peace wasn't going to last. I noticed Karen's blinds shifting from across the street, the faint twitch of her fingers pinning them open as she tried to spy without being obvious. She never realized how not subtle she was. By the time the mail truck came down the road, her blinds had snapped open 3 separate times. I didn't expect anything unusual, a regular stack of mail, maybe a flyer or two. But when the carrier handed me a thick envelope, he gave me that sympathetic look people reserve for homeowners dealing with HOA drama. The envelope was stamped with the HOA's official emblem. That should have been the first sign the day was heading in a ridiculous direction. Inside was a neatly stapled stack of papers labeled Growth Rate Report, Non-Compliant. I stood by the mailbox staring at it like it was written in another language. They had measured my grass, literally measured it, over a 3-day span and determined it had grown beyond acceptable margins by a fraction of an inch. Not enough to matter, not enough for any reasonable person to care, but enough for Karen and her friends to claim I was breaking community standards. Someone had even added photos. The timestamps told the whole story. Early morning, midday, afternoon, evening. Karen had been out there photographing my lawn like a wildlife researcher tracking a rare animal. She had circled tiny sections of my grass like they were evidence in a crime scene. The most absurd part wasn't the measurements. It was the formal demand at the end, a scheduled HOA lawn inspection set for Friday, during which I was expected to be present so they could evaluate ongoing lawn behavior. I didn't know whether to laugh or put my face in my hands. Lawn behavior, as if grass had attitude problems. As I walked back inside, I noticed movement from Karen's house again. She had stepped out onto her porch, arms crossed, wearing a prideful smile that looked far too triumphant for someone who had spent her free time stalking grass height. She clearly believed she finally had me cornered. But the day still had more in store. Around noon, while I was checking the fence line, a few neighbors wandered over, some curious, some irritated, some quietly amused. Word had spread about the growth report, and now it had become a neighborhood spectacle. One neighbor even joked that their grass was misbehaving too, and the HOA might need to discipline it. Still, underneath the humor was unease. People had started to realize what was happening. Karen wasn't just after my yard. She was setting a precedent. If she could weaponize the HOA against something as harmless as natural grass growth, then nothing would be off limits. Trash cans, porch cushions, garden decorations, anything she didn't like. By late afternoon, the HOA board sent out an official notice to the entire neighborhood, reminding everyone about proper lawn upkeep and preventing uncontrolled growth. They didn't mention me by name, but we all knew exactly who triggered it. The timing, the tone, the vague wording, Karen's fingerprints were all over it. The notice brought out more neighbors, each one wanting to share their own frustrations. Some had already been fined for their hedges being a little uneven, others for leaving their hose rolled the wrong way. It became clear that Karen had been targeting people for months, hiding behind anonymous complaints and rule citations. I wasn't the first, but I was the first to push back. Evening settled in with a heavy amber glow. The sky turned soft and warm, but the mood in the neighborhood stayed tight. Karen strutted across her yard, pretending to adjust her mailbox just so she could glance over at mine. Then she took out a little notebook, the same one she carried during board meetings, and scribbled something with dramatic flair. She wanted me rattled. She wanted me to panic before the inspection. She wanted control. But instead of worrying, I spent the evening planning. If the HOA was going to make my grass the centerpiece of their crusade, then I would give them a show they'd never forget. The night grew still. The neighborhood finally settled, unaware of the quiet shift happening in it. Karen thought she was building a case. She thought she was unstoppable. What she didn't know was that every move she made only helped me build something bigger, something that would unravel her entire pattern of harassment. And by the time the lawn inspection arrived, the tables were going to turn in a way Karen wouldn't be ready for. The next morning opened with a quiet that didn't feel natural. It was the kind of calm that settled over a neighborhood after a storm, not because the weather changed, but because everyone was waiting to see what happened next. My lawn, trimmed perfectly the day before while half the neighborhood watched in disbelief, still glistened with dew under the early light. Nothing looked out of place, and everything looked exactly as it should have looked all along. But the tension was still there. People walking their dogs moved slower than usual near my property. Some of them pretended not to look. Others stared openly, curious about what might unfold next. The only person missing from the morning spectacle was Karen. Her blinds stayed closed. Her car sat unmoved. Her perfect little flag in her yard hung still. And that silence from her side of the street said more than any yelling could. It wasn't long before the peace broke with the familiar sound of a car engine rolling to a slow stop in front of my home. When I stepped outside, I saw the same police cruiser from the day before. And stepping out of it was the same officer who had nearly doubled over laughing when Karen tried to convince him that fast-growing grass was an emergency. His return was unexpected, but not unwelcome. He approached with the relaxed confidence of someone who already knew more than he was saying. His expression wasn't troubled, it was thoughtful. The kind of look an investigator gets when the pieces of a puzzle finally start fitting together. I stood by the edge of my lawn as he walked up, taking in the morning air with a sense of guarded curiosity. Even without dialogue, his intent was clear. He wasn't here to check on the grass again. He was here because something had changed after yesterday's incident. He surveyed the street slowly, noting the neighbors watching from behind barely opened curtains, their curiosity almost as loud as their silence. He glanced at Karen's house, then back at mine, piecing together the social map of the neighborhood with practiced ease. It didn't take long for him to motion for me to follow him toward the sidewalk, where the view of both houses sat in perfect balance. He examined the stretch of ground Karen had accused me of blocking, tracing the path from one end to the other. No cars parked illegally, no obstructions, nothing unusual, nothing remotely close to an emergency. Just a clean-cut lawn and a simple suburban walkway. The officer's inspection might have seemed redundant, but the truth was far more complex. He wasn't reassessing the scene. He was gathering proof, evidence that the complaint had been false from the beginning. Not because he needed it, but because his department did. What had first seemed like another Karen outburst had grown into something larger. Behind us, a few neighbors lingered long enough to watch him take measured photos with his work tablet, documenting the area with professional precision instead of the amused disbelief he'd shown the day before. It was clear he wasn't treating this as a joke anymore. I noticed his gaze shift toward Karen's house again. Her car remained still. Her curtains didn't move. But the officer studied the property with far more intent this time, as if he expected her to appear any second and start another tirade. When she didn't, his focus only deepened. He didn't need words to make his next message clear. This wasn't about grass anymore. This was about a pattern, a chain of calls, a string of reports that started long before yesterday. As he finished documenting everything, he turned toward the patrol car again, pausing just long enough to acknowledge me with a confident, almost reassuring nod. It wasn't casual. It wasn't polite. It carried weight, the kind you only get from someone who had already made a decision and was ready to act on it. Before leaving, he studied the neighborhood one last time. Not the street, not the houses. The people. The quiet pockets of tension hanging over driveways and porches. The unease that had lingered long before this single incident. And in that careful evaluation, the story behind the grass, the sidewalk, and the emergency call began to reveal itself. The cruiser finally pulled away, though not quickly. The officer drove slow enough for neighbors to gasp, whisper, and guess. It was obvious that something official was brewing. And for the first time since I'd moved into the area, it wasn't directed at me, but at the one who had started the whole mess. Karen never stepped outside that morning, and her silence wasn't victory. It was nerves, the kind that settled over someone who didn't think her actions would ever be challenged, much less documented by the same authorities she weaponized. As the day stretched on, the atmosphere shifted. The neighbors who avoided eye contact before now lingered longer on their lawns, watching for signs of what might happen next. Some of them exchanged subtle looks. Others simply kept their distance from Karen's house. And through all of it, my lawn stood there, freshly cut, perfectly trimmed, and becoming the quiet center of a much bigger story, a story that was only beginning to unfold. By noon, one thing had become clear. The officer hadn't returned for a simple follow-up. He returned because yesterday wasn't an isolated complaint. It was one piece in a growing file. A file that now had the weight of proof behind it. And as the sun climbed above the rooftops, the real conflict began to take shape. Not between me and Karen, but between Karen and the consequences she never thought would find her. The morning after the dramatic visit from Officer Ramirez carried a strange calm, the kind that sits over a neighborhood when everyone is waiting to see what happens next. My lawn still looked perfectly normal, trimmed just a few days earlier. Yet I could feel eyes from behind curtains, watching for any chance to prove I'd broken some imaginary rule. By then, word had spread across the block that Karen had called 911 on my grass. Some neighbors whispered out of curiosity, others out of disbelief, and a few tried to avoid eye contact entirely. It was clear that the situation wasn't going away. Karen had filed a formal danger to community landscaping complaint with the HOA overnight, and she wasn't about to back down now that law enforcement was involved. That afternoon, Officer Ramirez returned, not in an emergency rush, but in a steady, deliberate walk toward my property. His presence caught more attention. Curtains moved, a front door cracked open, even Karen stepped onto her porch, arms folded like she expected applause for bringing backup. He didn't speak to anyone at first. Instead, he circled my yard slowly, taking photos, noting measurements, and checking the time-stamped city regulations from his tablet. His expression stayed neutral, though Karen hovered nearby like a hawk, waiting for someone to validate her delusion. When he was finished with the inspection, he approached me calmly. I stood in my driveway, arms crossed, expecting more questions, but instead, he asked about something entirely different. He wanted to know how long I had lived in the neighborhood, how often Karen had filed complaints against me, and whether she'd ever escalated her behavior beyond HOA meetings and nasty notes. The shift in his questions told me something had clicked for him. He was looking for patterns. I explained everything. Her daily patrols around the block, the way she photographed my house at random times, her habit of telling guests where they were allowed to park, and even the time she tried to measure the height of my shrubs using a kitchen spatula she said she converted to inches. His brow tightened more with each detail. When I mentioned the HOA's history of siding with her no matter what, he nodded as though a puzzle piece had snapped into place. He told me quietly that the department had received multiple non-emergency calls from this address over the past year, all from the same number, all targeting different neighbors for trivial reasons. Mailbox color, porch lights left on, even children laughing too loudly. The woman causing all of it was standing less than 20 feet away, pretending to tidy a potted plant while listening to every word. From the corner of my eye, I saw her flinch when he mentioned misuse of emergency services. She stayed still, but her posture shifted just enough to reveal she knew she was in trouble. The officer asked to see my home security footage from the day of the call. Specifically, the time Karen claimed I had blocked the sidewalk with my overgrown hazard. I pulled it up on my phone. He watched the video closely. My car parked, unmoved, my lawn looking completely normal, Karen pacing around the edge of my yard taking dramatic photos as if she were documenting a crime scene. He watched the clip twice before letting out a long, controlled breath. Then he said he needed a copy of it for an official report. That was the first moment I realized this situation was heading somewhere bigger than an HOA complaint. He thanked me for cooperating and walked toward Karen, who pretended she didn't see him approaching. She froze mid-step like she believed staying perfectly still would somehow save her. Though I couldn't hear his words from where I stood, the tone carried clearly. Not angry, but sharply firm. His hand gestured toward my house, then toward the street, then at her phone. She kept shaking her head in tiny jerks, like she couldn't believe someone wasn't supporting her version of events. The neighbors who'd crept onto their porches stayed quiet, watching every detail. When the conversation grew more intense, Karen threw her hands up in an exaggerated performance, pacing in angry circles. Her frustration had finally reached its boiling point. But Officer Ramirez didn't react. He stayed calm, letting her burn herself out. By the time he stepped back, she looked deflated, less like the HOA powerhouse she pretended to be, and more like someone who just realized she had pushed her luck too far. He returned to me one last time before leaving and assured me that additional follow-up would be happening soon. He couldn't give more details yet, but the confidence in his tone told me everything. The situation was no longer about grass. It wasn't about paint colors or hedge heights. It was about a pattern of harassment, misuse of emergency resources, and repeated attempts to weaponize authority. As his car pulled away, neighbors slowly retreated inside, buzzing with whispered speculation, and Karen stood stiffly in her yard, clutching her phone like a lifeline. But for the first time since I'd lived there, her eyes didn't hold that smug certainty. Instead, they flickered with something unfamiliar: fear. The sun dipped lower and the street grew quiet. A strange tension settled over the neighborhood, the kind that signals something big is coming. The next morning arrived with the kind of uneasy calm that made the whole neighborhood feel like it was waiting for something to happen. Word had spread fast. Everyone knew Karen had called 911 over grass height, then tried to twist the story, then attempted to target me again with board members who were finally starting to question her behavior. I woke up early, long before sunrise, and stepped outside to check on the yard. The sprinklers clicked on. The air still felt cool. The trimmed grass looked perfect, which made the whole situation feel even more ridiculous. The latest warning note from Karen still sat taped to my door. Seeing it made my chest tighten with irritation, but I let out a slow breath and tossed it into the trash. I had bigger things to think about. The officer from the day before had hinted that he'd be back, not to talk to me, to talk to her. Around mid-morning, neighbors started drifting outside. Some watered their plants, others walked their dogs a little slower than usual so they could watch what was happening. A kind of quiet tension sat over the street. Everyone sensed something was coming. Everyone had opinions. Everyone was waiting to see if today would be the day the HOA finally confronted Karen's pattern of harassment. It didn't take long for the black SUV to roll up. The same officer stepped out. His posture was calm but focused, the kind of stance someone holds when they know exactly why they're there. He didn't look annoyed. He looked ready. He glanced over at me briefly, gave a short nod, and headed toward Karen's house. The front door opened fast, almost like she had been waiting behind it, listening for movement. Karen stepped out with a pointed expression, the one she always wore when she wanted to look like she was in control. She folded her arms, chin lifted, trying to set the tone before he even spoke. From my distance across the street, I watched the scene unfold in silence. Other neighbors slowly emerged from their porches, pretending to do chores. Nobody wanted to miss this. The officer explained something calmly, and I could see Karen's face start to tighten. Her mouth moved quickly, hands gesturing in that frantic way she used whenever she felt her authority slipping. She leaned forward, then back, pacing like she was trying to rewrite the whole story with hand movements and frustration. The officer didn't budge. He didn't argue or match her tone. He simply kept talking. Steady and clear. Like someone who had handled situations much bigger than irritated HOA members. Every time Karen pointed toward my house, he redirected her. That alone made the neighbors exchange glances. For a moment, Karen froze mid-gesture. Whatever he said next knocked the wind out of her argument. Her arms dropped, her mouth fell open. She tried to recover, but the officer raised one hand slightly, asking her to pause. She did. For once, she actually listened. He handed her a form. A notice, something official. She stared at it like it had personally insulted her. The officer spoke again. Calm, steady, a tone that meant the conversation was ending. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. Not the embarrassed kind, the furious kind. The kind she only showed when she realized she lost. Her husband stepped into the doorway looking confused. She thrust the paper at him and stormed back inside without another word. The officer gave him a patient nod and returned to his SUV. The moment he drove off, the entire street let out a soft, collective breath. Nobody cheered, nobody clapped. But the relief was real. I walked back toward my porch, feeling the tension start to fade from my shoulders. It wasn't over yet. She would react, people like Karen always did. But something shifted. The balance that had always tilted unfairly toward her control was finally settling. By evening, everything seemed to settle into a strange calm. No new notes were taped to my door. No HOA emails showed up in my inbox. Karen's curtains stayed shut. Her car stayed parked. The street finally felt still. I spent some time outside cleaning up tools, mowing a few edges, and tightening the last bit of fencing I had meant to fix. As the sun went down, neighbors walked by, offering quick nods or small smiles. Nobody said a word, but the message was clear. They knew what happened. They saw a small piece of justice. But that night, an email landed in the neighborhood inbox. An emergency HOA meeting, mandatory. Topic: community conduct and reports of misuse of emergency services. Neighbors started talking across yards. Whispers spread like wildfire. Everyone already knew who it was about. Everyone knew what triggered it. For the first time since she moved in, Karen wasn't in charge of the narrative. I sat on my porch and watched the porch lights flick on across the community. It felt like the turning point. The moment the neighborhood finally decided to do something about her pattern of calling the authorities for petty reasons, about her habit of stretching rules and twisting problems, about her need to control everyone around her. In the quiet of the night air, it finally hit me that the story wasn't really about grass height. It wasn't even about me. It was about a community finally reaching its limit. The meeting would happen tomorrow, and one thing was certain. It would not go the way Karen expected. The neighborhood was tired, and tomorrow they would be heard. The morning after the hearing carried a strange quiet, the type that settles over a neighborhood when everyone is waiting for someone else to make the next move. The sun sat low over the roofs, stretching soft orange light across the lawns. Mine glowed a deep, healthy green, trimmed the night before out of pure habit. After the week I'd had, mowing had become a kind of therapy. Before I even stepped outside, I started the video the same way I always do, reminding everyone tuning in to tell me which country they're watching from and to like and subscribe for more stories. Then I walked out to face whatever the day planned to send my way. The HOA board had been ordered to hold an emergency meeting after the officer's report and the judge's ruling. For the first time since moving in, I wasn't the nervous one. Instead, the board members looked like students waiting for exam results they knew they had failed. Karen, standing in the center like she always did, looked furious enough to chew through the microphone stand. People arrived in clusters, whispering as they found seats, some watching me with the kind of supportive nods I hadn't seen earlier in the week. News travels fast in a neighborhood, especially when it makes the person everyone fears look ridiculous. When the meeting opened, the president of the HOA cleared his throat, trying to steer the agenda without acknowledging the shift in authority. But it didn't matter. Everything pointed back to the one topic nobody could avoid: the false 911 call. Even more damaging was the audio recording the officer had attached to his report. Hearing Karen on the speaker claiming my grass was criminally overgrown while standing in front of a yard that looked like a magazine cover turned the room into a slow-burning embarrassment. Neighbors shifted in their chairs, some crossed their arms, a few stared directly at Karen, waiting to see how she'd wiggle out of this one. She didn't disappoint. She took the microphone with the confidence of someone used to controlling every room she walked into. Then she blamed the angle of the sunlight. She blamed her allergies. She blamed rapid growth grass hybrids, something nobody had ever heard of. The more she talked, the more the boards sank into their chairs. It became obvious to everyone that this wasn't about my lawn. It was about control. Eventually, the HOA board had enough. He interrupted her mid-sentence, something no one had dared do all year. The board excused her from speaking and announced 2 points of business that shook the room. The first was a vote to strip Karen of her authority to issue citations. The second was a motion to remove her from the board entirely. The vote wasn't close. Hands shot up fast, almost relieved, like people had been waiting for this chance but didn't know how to take it until now. Even longtime allies of hers lifted their hands quietly. Watching her face shift from disbelief to anger to a cold, empty stare was something I'll never forget. The meeting closed with a surprising update. The board apologized to me publicly. They admitted the citation was invalid, the call was unnecessary, and the incident should never have escalated the way it did. A few neighbors clapped, a few apologized in person afterward. It felt strange being the center of attention in a way that didn't involve someone trying to report me. But the story didn't end on polite apologies. Not even close. 2 days later, while loading tools back into the shed, a white sedan rolled slowly down the street. The same officer who had responded to the original call stepped out with a calm, patient expression. He said he was there to deliver an update. Karen had been officially charged for misusing emergency services, and the department had decided to add a penalty for obstructing an officer's time. It wouldn't put her in jail, but it would hit hard enough to sting. I stood there listening, surprised at how close everything had come to spiraling out of control over something as simple as grass height. The officer shook his head, as if still trying to understand how people let themselves get so wound up. Before he left, he looked at the yard and joked that if he had grass like mine, he'd take pictures of it for bragging rights. When he pulled away, I realized the neighborhood felt different. More relaxed, more balanced. Without Karen lurking around, snapping photos and calling meetings over every blade of grass and misplaced trash bin, the street breathed easier. The biggest change came a week later when the HOA circulated a new policy adjusting enforcement procedures. No more anonymous complaints, no more automatic citations without verification, and no more 911 calls unless there was a legitimate emergency. It was a small thing, but small things have a way of shifting an entire community. As for Karen, she avoided the neighborhood as much as possible. Her house darkened earlier each night. Her car appeared only briefly, usually early in the morning before anyone else stepped out. Rumors said she was considering moving, but no one knew for sure. One evening while watering the garden, I stepped back and looked over the lawn. The way the grass caught the breeze almost made the entire week feel surreal. A simple patch of earth had turned into the center of a neighborhood storm, and then into the thing that finally exposed what everyone had been too tired or too scared to confront. The real satisfaction wasn't in winning against her, it was in watching the neighborhood reclaim itself. People waved more, kids played outside longer, neighbors talked instead of whispered. Before heading inside, I recorded the last part of the story for the video. I kept it steady, honest, and simple. I told viewers that sometimes the loudest people aren't the strongest. Sometimes the real power comes from truth and patience shown in small things, like a camera, a calm officer, and a lawn that never needed defending in the first place. Then I wished everyone a good night, asked them to drop the country they're watching from, and thanked them for sticking with me until the end. The neighborhood settled into silence. Peaceful. Normal. Exactly the way it should have been all along.